400 warriors, 12,000 enemies. No walls, no city, no reinforcements, only grass, wind, and an open horizon that offers nowhere to hide. By every rule of war, this battle should not exist, and yet, it does. Because what happened on the steppe that day was not decided by strength, but by belief. The larger army believed it was winning, and that belief destroyed it. Most people think wars are won by numbers, by bigger armies, by louder charges. But the steppe teaches a different lesson. Here, numbers can become a liability. Speed replaces armor, discipline replaces courage, and deception becomes deadlier than steel. This is the story of how 400 warriors of the Khan faced an enemy 30 times their size and did not run. Not because they were fearless, but because fear had already been removed from the equation. If you want legends, this story will disappoint you. There are no heroic speeches here, no last stands, no miraculous rescues. There is only calculation, patience, and a lie so convincing that an entire army walked willingly into its own destruction. And it began long before the first arrow was fired. The steppe is not empty. It only looks that way to those who do not understand it. To an untrained eye, it is a flat ocean of grass stretching endlessly in every direction, featureless, silent, exposed. But to those raised upon it, the steppe is a weapon. It offers no shelter, no choke points, no defensive positions. And that is precisely what makes it lethal. On the steppe, you cannot hide weakness. You cannot pause to reorganize. You cannot afford confusion. Any army that loses cohesion here does not retreat. It dissolves. Movement is everything. Speed is survival. And the ability to turn, reform, and strike again decides who lives long enough to fight another day. This is why steppe warfare produced armies unlike any the world had seen before. Not masses of poorly coordinated men, but compact, disciplined formations trained to move as a single organism. The warriors of the Khan did not fight as individuals. They fought as systems. Every man knew his place. Every movement had purpose. Every retreat was measured, especially the retreats. Because on the steppe, a retreat is never just a retreat. It is a message. The enemy army that marched into this land did not understand this. They came with confidence, justified, at least on paper. 12,000 men, veterans, infantry supported by cavalry, commanders who had won battles before. They believed the open terrain favored them. They believed their numbers would overwhelm any resistance. They believed that if the enemy turned and ran, the battle was already over. This belief was not foolish. It was human. Throughout history, pursuit has been associated with victory. When one side breaks and flees, the other believes the war has been decided. And on most battlefields, that belief is correct. But the steppe is not most battlefields. Here, pursuit is the most dangerous decision a commander can make, because pursuit requires speed without order, momentum without control, emotion without restraint. And once an army begins to chase, it stops thinking. The commanders of the 12,000 did not see a trap. They saw an opportunity, and that was enough. The 400 warriors waiting for them were not chosen at random. They were not the strongest, nor the most aggressive. They were the most disciplined. Men trained to obey signals without hesitation, to ride for hours without breaking formation, to trust orders even when every instinct screamed to do the opposite, especially when ordered to run. Because running, for them, was not shameful. It was tactical. From childhood, they were taught a simple truth. The steppe does not reward pride. It rewards patience. And patience on that day would be mistaken for weakness. As the two forces finally came within sight of one another, dust rising on the horizon, the imbalance became unmistakable. A river of men advancing toward a small, compact force that looked absurdly outnumbered. Any observer would have predicted the same outcome. The 400 would engage briefly, then break, then be hunted down and destroyed. And that prediction was exactly what the enemy commanders expected. They did not know they were being prepared, conditioned, invited, because the battle was not about to begin with a clash. It was about to begin with a lie. The enemy army advanced in formation, banners visible, armor catching the light of the open sky. 12,000 men moving as one body. From a distance, it looked unstoppable. And that was the first mistake. Large armies inspire confidence, not only in those who follow them, but in those who command them. Confidence dulls caution. It replaces observation with assumption, and it turns probability into certainty. The commanders at the head of this force had already decided how the battle would end. They did not need to consider complex maneuvers. They did not need to adapt. The enemy was smaller. The enemy was isolated. And the enemy stood in their way. Everything else, they believed, was irrelevant. They had faced steppe warriors before. They had heard stories of speed and arrows and sudden attacks. But stories have a way of becoming smaller once numbers are on your side. 12,000 men do not fear 400. They pity them. Orders were given calmly. Advance, maintain pressure, force engagement. There was no urgency, no tension. Why rush when victory is inevitable? The enemy believed time worked in their favor. They did not realize that time was the weapon being used against them. Across the open ground, the 400 waited. No speeches, no visible preparation, just silence. They could see the size of the approaching force as clearly as anyone else. They knew the odds. And yet, there was no panic, because panic requires uncertainty. And these men were certain. They were certain of their training, certain of their commanders, certain that every movement to come had already been accounted for. They were not thinking about survival. They were thinking about timing, when to advance, when to strike, and most importantly, when to withdraw. Because withdrawal, done correctly, would decide everything. The first contact was brief. Arrows darkened the sky, not in volleys meant to kill, but in patterns meant to test. Range, response, discipline. The 400 advanced just enough to be seen, just enough to be engaged. They struck quickly, precisely, then pulled back. Not in disorder, not in panic, but not obviously controlled either. To the enemy commanders watching from a distance, the movement looked familiar. A probing attack, a failed engagement. The smaller force had tested the line and recoiled, exactly as expected, exactly as predicted. The enemy pressed forward. Their confidence grew with every step. The 400 did not stand their ground. They yielded space. Slowly, at first, deliberately. Each movement backward reinforced the same conclusion in the enemy's mind. They are breaking. And once an army is believed to be breaking, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes prey. Here lies the most dangerous illusion in warfare. When a force appears to retreat, the enemy no longer sees soldiers. They see opportunity. Commanders begin to imagine the aftermath, a routed enemy, a decisive victory, honor, reputation. The pressure to pursue becomes irresistible, because pursuit promises finality. End the battle. Destroy the enemy. Do not let them escape. The commanders of the 12,000 did not give the order immediately. They did not need to. Momentum carried the decision for them. Units advanced faster than instructed. Formations stretched. Spacing widened. Cohesion began to loosen, not from fear, but from eagerness. And eagerness is far more dangerous. The 400 retreated further. The distance between the two forces grew, then shrank, then grew again, always just out of reach. Close enough to provoke, far enough to deny closure. It was infuriating. It was tempting. And it felt like victory. The enemy believed they were watching an army collapse. What they were actually watching was an army executing its most difficult maneuver, a controlled withdrawal under pressure, a movement that requires more discipline than an advance, more coordination than a charge, and absolute trust. One mistake here would have meant annihilation. One rider breaking formation, one man fleeing too early. But none did, because these men had practiced this moment more than any other. At this point, the battle could still have been saved, if the enemy had paused, if they had reformed, if they had questioned why 400 men were still intact after yielding so much ground. But confidence does not ask questions. Confidence accelerates. The chase was on, and once the chase began, they could not be stopped. The 400 were no longer simply retreating. They were shaping the battlefield, pulling the enemy forward, stretching their lines, separating units from command. The steppe offered no landmarks, no visual anchors. Distance became difficult to judge. Signals became harder to see. What had been an army began to feel like a mass moving forward with only one goal in mind: catch them, finish this. The lie was now complete. The enemy was committed, and the steppe was about to close around them. The retreat now looked undeniable. From the enemy's perspective, everything confirmed it. The smaller force continued to fall back. The distance widened. The pressure worked. Every instinct, every lesson learned in conventional warfare reinforced the same conclusion. The enemy is fleeing. And when soldiers believe the enemy is fleeing, their behavior changes. They lean forward in the saddle. They push harder. They stop waiting for signals. Because no one wants to be the one who let victory escape. This is the moment where discipline is tested, and usually abandoned. A feigned retreat is the most dangerous maneuver in warfare, not for the enemy, for the ones performing it. It requires an army to pretend to lose control without ever actually losing it, to invite pursuit without triggering panic, to look weak while remaining perfectly synchronized. Most armies cannot do this. They break too early. They turn too slowly. They lose men to fear before the enemy ever reaches them. This is why the tactic is rare, and why, when it works, it is devastating. The 400 were not improvising. Each stage of the withdrawal had been calculated. Distances, timing, signals invisible to the untrained eye. A raised arm, a shift in formation, a rider changing position. To the enemy it looked chaotic. To the 400, it was a language, and they were speaking it fluently. As the pursuit intensified, the enemy army began to change shape. The front surged forward. The rear lagged behind. What had once been a compact formation stretched thin across the open steppe. Communications suffered. Orders had to travel farther. Responses came slower. Some units moved faster than others. Some commanders pushed harder, unwilling to lose momentum. The army was no longer acting as one. It was fragmenting. The steppe amplified every mistake. With no terrain to slow them, the fastest units pulled ahead. Cavalry outran infantry. Younger soldiers outpaced veterans. Spacing widened. Gaps appeared. But no one stopped. Stopping felt like losing, and losing was impossible, or so they believed. This was the point of no return, not marked by a signal, not announced by a command, but defined by psychology. Once an army commits emotionally to pursuit, logic becomes secondary. Warnings are ignored. Caution is dismissed as cowardice. Any voice urging restraint is drowned out by the forward motion of thousands of men convinced they are moments away from victory. The enemy commanders were no longer directing a battle. They were chasing an outcome. The 400 sensed the shift, not through sight alone, but through rhythm. The sound of hooves behind them changed. The pattern of arrows altered. The spacing told a story. The enemy was no longer advancing. They were running. And that changed everything. The retreat slowed, just slightly, enough to be noticed, enough to renew hope. The enemy surged again, desperate to close the distance. This was intentional. Every adjustment was bait. Every pause was calculated to pull them further in, further from cohesion, further from command, further from safety. The 400 were no longer reacting. They were leading. At a distance, it still looked like flight, but up close, something was wrong. The retreat was too clean, the formation too intact. Men did not scatter. They did not drop weapons. They did not abandon wounded. These were not the signs of collapse. They were the signs of control. But by the time this realization began to form, it was already too late. The battlefield had shifted. Not geographically, psychologically. The enemy believed the battle was almost over. The 400 knew it was just beginning. And somewhere, unseen beyond the edges of the pursuit, the steppe waited, silent, open, and ready to close. The change did not come suddenly. There was no signal horn, no shouted command, no dramatic turn of banners. That is how encirclements are usually imagined, but real ones begin quietly, almost politely. The 400 slowed their retreat again, not enough to stop, not enough to turn, just enough to allow the enemy to feel control. This was critical, because an encirclement only works if the enemy believes they are still advancing. Belief maintains momentum. Momentum maintains disorder, and disorder creates opportunity. The enemy's leading elements were now far ahead of their support. What had once been a single army had stretched into layers, each moving at a different speed, each with a different perception of the battlefield. The front believed victory was seconds away. The rear believed they were reinforcing success. The center struggled to understand what was happening at all. This is how armies die, not all at once, but in pieces. Somewhere beyond the enemy's flanks, movement began. Subtle, almost invisible against the vastness of the steppe. Small units that had not participated in the retreat. Riders who had never been seen by the pursuing force. They did not charge. They repositioned. Because the purpose of an encirclement is not impact. It is isolation. The 400 were no longer just retreating forward. They were bending the enemy's advance inward. The pursuit narrowed, unconsciously. The enemy did not realize they were being guided. They simply followed the path that felt fastest, closest, most decisive. The path chosen for them. At first, the signs were easy to dismiss. A unit on the flank failed to respond to a signal. Another fell behind. A messenger did not return. These things happen in battle. No one panics over small inconsistencies, not when victory feels certain. But then the space around them began to change. The steppe, once wide and open, felt different. The horizon no longer felt distant. Sounds carried strangely. Movement appeared where it should not have been. The sense of direction blurred. This is the effect of losing spatial awareness, a subtle but devastating phenomenon. When an army no longer knows where it is, it cannot know what to do. The 400 felt it first. They had been waiting for this moment. The rhythm behind them had fractured. The pressure was uneven. Some enemy units were dangerously close. Others were too far back to matter. The pursuit had lost symmetry. And asymmetry is vulnerability. The retreat ended. Not abruptly, not dramatically. The 400 did not turn all at once. They slowed, then stabilized, then began to move laterally. To an observer, it might have looked like confusion. To those who understood the language of steppe warfare, it was unmistakable. The lie had ended. The enemy's leading units hesitated, only for a moment. But a moment is all it takes. They had been prepared to chase. They had not been prepared to reassess. Momentum carried them forward, straight into uncertainty. From the flanks, the steppe finally revealed its answer. Movement became undeniable. Riders appeared where there should have been none. Not charging wildly, not shouting. They moved with purpose. They moved to positions. They moved to close distance. Not to the enemy's front, but to its sides. Encirclements does not feel like being surrounded. At first, it feels like the battlefield shrinking. Paths that were open moments ago no longer are. Units that could have withdrawn find space occupied. Messages fail to travel. The enemy commanders sensed something was wrong. But sensing is not understanding. And understanding now came too late. The 400 turned. Not in defiance, not in desperation, but with precision. The retreat had fulfilled its purpose. The enemy was no longer an army advancing together. It was a mass, stretched thin, fragmented, emotionally committed, and exposed. The steppe, once neutral, now became hostile. Every direction held threat. Every pause invited attack. The enemy had chased what they believed was a fleeing force. They had not noticed the ground beneath them shifting. They had not noticed the space closing. They had not noticed the silence behind their own lines. The encirclement was not complete yet, but it no longer needed to be, because the moment an army realizes it is being surrounded, it has already lost. The realization did not arrive all at once. It never does. At first, it came as confusion. A unit attempted to maneuver and found space already occupied. A commander sent orders and received no response. A formation tried to realign and discovered it no longer knew where its neighbors were. This was not yet panic. This was something worse: disorientation. The enemy army had crossed an invisible threshold. Beyond it, coordination became impossible. The pursuit had pulled them too far forward. The retreat had pulled them too far apart. Now, the battlefield was no longer something they controlled. It was something acting upon them. The 400 moved with renewed purpose. They did not rush. Speed was no longer required. The enemy had provided all the momentum needed. Instead, the 400 focused on position, angles, spacing, timing. Because once an army loses its shape, it can be dismantled piece by piece. The first collapses were local. A forward unit attempted to withdraw and was struck from the side. Another tried to hold ground and was attacked from multiple directions. Messages failed to reach command. Officers shouted, signals were raised, but without cohesion, commands became noise. And noise does not save armies. Encirclement is not about surrounding every man. It is about severing trust. Trust between units, trust in leadership, trust in the direction of movement. Once soldiers no longer believe that the man beside them is supported, fear begins to spread. Not as terror, as doubt. The enemy commanders tried to reassert control. They ordered halts. They attempted to regroup. But halting a mass in motion is far harder than starting it. Units at the front could not hear them. Units at the rear did not understand the urgency. Some believed the orders were temporary. Others believed they were unnecessary. And some never received them at all. This was the moment panic became inevitable. Because panic does not begin when soldiers are attacked. It begins when they no longer understand where the attack is coming from. The steppe offered no cover, no clear direction of threat. Danger seemed to exist everywhere at once. The 400 exploited this. They did not seek decisive clashes. They struck where cohesion was weakest: flanks, gaps, isolated pockets. Every successful strike deepened the sense of encirclement. Every withdrawal path that failed increased desperation. The enemy's numerical advantage now worked against them. More men meant more confusion. More movement meant more obstruction. More voices meant less clarity. Units interfered with one another. Commands contradicted. Paths became blocked by their own forces. The army was too large to maneuver and too disorganized to fight. Fear finally surfaced, not as a scream, as hesitation. Soldiers slowed. Formations faltered. Men began to look backward instead of forward. That single shift changed everything. Once soldiers stop advancing toward the enemy and start searching for escape, the battle is already lost. The encirclement tightened, not visibly, not ceremonially, but functionally. Every attempted withdrawal was met with resistance. Every regrouping attempt drew attack. The enemy realized they were no longer choosing where to move. They were reacting, and reaction is always slower than intention. At this stage, casualties rose rapidly, not because of reckless charges, but because the enemy could not defend themselves properly. Shields faced the wrong direction. Formations were incomplete. Wounded men could not be evacuated. The battlefield became fragmented into dozens of isolated struggles, each unwinnable on its own. The 400 did not need to press everywhere. They pressed where it mattered. Command elements, messengers, units attempting to restore order. Every blow removed another thread holding the army together. Eventually, resistance became sporadic, not absent, but meaningless. Small groups fought bravely, others surrendered, many simply ran. But there was nowhere left to run to. The steppe that once seemed endless now offered no direction that felt safe. Every horizon looked the same, every path felt exposed. The army of 12,000 no longer existed. What remained was a scattering of men, each acting alone, each trying to survive a situation that no longer resembled a battle. And the 400, still disciplined, still coordinated, moved among them with methodical efficiency. This was no longer warfare. It was resolution. When the fighting finally subsided, the steppe did not change. The wind still moved the grass. The horizon still stretched endlessly in every direction. But the battlefield was no longer contested. It had been decided. There was no single moment that marked the end. No final charge. No surrender signal carried across the field. The battle ended the way it had unfolded, gradually, unevenly, and without ceremony. Groups of resistance collapsed one after another. Some fought until they could no longer stand. Others laid down their weapons when they understood there was no formation left to return to. Many never fully realized what had happened. They only knew that the army they had trusted was gone. The 400 did not pursue indiscriminately. There was no need. An army that has lost cohesion does not require further force to defeat. It defeats itself. Men flee in different directions. Supplies are abandoned. Wounded are left behind. The battlefield expands beyond the original point of contact, not through advance, but through collapse. The commanders of the 12,000 were among the first to lose control. Some were cut off early. Others found themselves issuing orders that no longer had meaning. An order requires a system to carry it. When that system is gone, leadership becomes symbolic. Titles remain. Authority does not. The 400, by contrast, never lost their system. Even now they moved according to plan. They secured positions. They regrouped. They accounted for their own. Losses were acknowledged, not ignored. The battle had never been about glory. It had been about outcome. What made further resistance impossible was not just defeat. It was understanding. At some point, survivors realized that no part of the battlefield offered advantage. The enemy was not concentrated in one direction. There was no clear path through. Any attempt to form a new line exposed another flank. Any pause invited attack. The battlefield no longer had a front, only danger. This is the final effect of encirclement. Not annihilation, but inevitability. Once an army accepts that there is no decision left to make, resistance ceases to be meaningful. Bravery becomes irrelevant. Numbers become irrelevant. Only survival remains. The 400 did not need to kill 12,000 men. They needed to break the army. Once that was done, the rest followed naturally. Desertion, capture, dispersal. The enemy force dissolved into the steppe that had betrayed them. From a distance, the outcome seemed impossible. 400 against 12,000. But distance hides process. Up close, the result was not miraculous. It was mechanical. A sequence of decisions and reactions, each building upon the last. The outcome had been shaped long before the first man fell. The steppe did not favor the 400 because they were fewer. It favored them because they understood it. They understood movement. They understood timing. They understood the human mind under pressure. Most importantly, they understood that victory does not require destroying an enemy's strength. It requires destroying their ability to act together. By the time silence returns to the field, the battle had become something else. Not a story of heroism, but a demonstration of how systems defeat numbers, of how discipline defeats instinct, of how belief, once manipulated, becomes a weapon against those who hold it.